said, tonight we are really delighted to welcome Chris Reed, Principal of Stoss Landscape Urbanism and Associate Professor in Practice at the Graduate School of Design at Harvard, to UNSW. This is his first visit to Sydney, so it's a special few days for him. He's taking in quite a bit in 4 days' time. In welcoming all of you, we acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation on whose traditional land we are gathered, and their elders, past and present, custodians of this land. I want to thank Chris tonight for taking leave from balmy Boston to visit Australia in winter. I don't think he quite realized what he was in for, but he's lucked out with Sydney. His visit to Sydney has been very pleasant. Prior to visiting Sydney, he arrived here on Saturday. He spent a couple of days at RMIT, where the weather was not quite so pleasant, but it was okay. But he's had a good 4 days in Sydney, and I thank Helen Lockhead and Courtney Good, who were kind enough to show Chris around on the weekend. In addition, as all of you know, these moments are nothing if they are not teamwork, right? We are all about teamwork. So I would, in the first instance, like to thank our Dean, Alex Hans, who's been very generous in supporting Chris's visit to UNSW, as well as the contributions from RMIT, and Chris himself has invested time and money in this visit, and that's been very, very appreciated by us. I also thank so many people on the faculty who have helped pull this together, in particular Linda Corkery, who planted the seed appropriately so many moons ago. Lizette, Paul Denham, Julia Carlson, Margaret McGinnis, Cass James, and Liz Roberts all helped us get this together. And Steve across the way at JG's, where you hopefully all have just had some drink and food, was very generous as well. So just a little bit about Chris. Over the last 2 days, he's shown me, and I think a few other people, that he's a pretty quick study, this guy. In addition to what you've heard about him being an urbanist, he might come back to Australia sooner than we think. I noted that he ordered a long black with ease, no hesitation, and that's challenging for Americans, I have to say. Very challenging. To students, he infused his recount of a long walk that he had on Sunday, his walk from Coogee to Bondi, with an incredible amount of landscape detail. I think he embarrassed our students, I have to say. They were just boggled by his attention to landscape detail, and particularly noting so quickly what makes Sydney so unique and so special. So that was terrific. And then yesterday at a lunch at the White House here on campus, when I said I was going to the till, he quickly understood that I meant I was going for money, not to do something with soil. So that was good too. But more importantly, in a studio session yesterday, in a lecture, and in conversation today, he really helped us very quickly reaffirm the critical role that landscape and ecological understandings have to the makings of our cities. And it's in that sense, from that perspective, that we're really pleased to welcome Chris to the Faculty of the Built Environment this evening. So there's much more to Chris, as you'll hear. He'll speak for approximately an hour, and then we have 20 minutes or so for questions, and we have a microphone, so please do generate some questions. And now I will hand it over to Chris. I hope you enjoy and are inspired by this presentation this evening. Thanks, Chris.
Great. Thanks, Catherine. Thanks, Bruce. It's a delight to be here. I've had a wonderful couple of days in Sydney, and it's nice to have all of you here tonight with us. I too want to thank the Dean and Bruce and the school for essentially putting up the money and the support to get me here. To Linda and Catherine for being diligent on a number of occasions to make sure that they got me here. And particularly to Catherine for her hospitality the last few days. It's been really quite nice. I too want to recognize Courtney Good. Where's Courtney? Yeah, there's Courtney. So Courtney is a GSD graduate working at Aspect Studios. Courtney was one of my research assistants on the book. In fact, she was the last research assistant on the book. So late in the process that her name never made its way into the book. She's the only research assistant whose name is not in the book. So it's important to acknowledge her role. Thank you, Courtney. And when we do a second edition, it'll be known as the Courtney Special Edition. Ecologies, the Projective Ecologies project critically rethinks the project of ecology in relationship to design, thinking and design practices over the last 20 years or so, but also looking forward. It's timely in a way, given the contemporary conversations about environment and climate change, et cetera, et cetera. But it was also an attempt for me to step outside of practice and to reflect on some of my own influences, but also on where the field has gone relative to the environment and ecological sciences. Ecology has played such a critical role in design thinking over the last 20 years. It's become commonplace in some instances. Sustainability, of course, is a term that's now thrown around a lot, particularly by designers, and they claim that anything they do is sustainable in one form or another. I found that a lot of people were using the term ecology in the same way. And so ecology, in that sense, was losing its critical meaning. And it was an attempt for us to kind of just stand back from it all, assess where we are, assess how we got here, and begin to assess where we're going. It is very much a collaborative project. Nina Marie Lister was my co-editor on this project. Nina Marie is trained as an ecologist, works as a planner, and is very design savvy. She's been a frequent collaborator of mine on projects in practice. And so I think it's very important that a book that takes on the idea of ecology within design thinking is really generated from folks coming from different but collaborative backgrounds. In a sense, one of the questions behind the book is whether we've exhausted ecology's critical potential to inform design and design thinking. Does the acceptance of ecology so easily within design practice signal an end to this set of critical investigations, or is there more to do? So the book takes on this question, it takes on the questions of where are ecological thinking and theory now? What do current trajectories of research suggest for future investigation, both in the natural sciences and in design? And how can advances in ecological research and modeling, in social theory and in digital visualization, for instance, inform with greater rigor more robust design thinking and practice? Now, there are three parts to the book. The first column are a set of individuals, designers, art theorists, ecologists, who are contributing new essays to the book, to the topic. These are all original essays. The middle column are folks who have written essays that I thought was critical to how we got here within the profession. And so these are folks, again, designers, ecologists, who have written as far back as 1970, whose work we thought it was really important to consolidate and present in context with one another. And then the third part, the third column, are a set of designers and ecologists who have contributed drawings to the project that really look at the way that we all have started to think about, represent, and construct ideas about dynamic systems within the world. And so it's this combination of new and old essays and drawings that we hope would reverberate with one another. Now, if we step back, of course, in the last 3 decades, the field of ecology has moved from a classical concern with stability, certainty, and order to more contemporary understandings of dynamic change and of the related phenomena of adaptability, resilience, and flexibility. Yet for many of us, ecology is not simply a project of the natural sciences. Many researchers and theorists and social commentators have used ecology as a broader idea or metaphor for a set of conditions and relationships with political, economic, and social implications. James Corner was among the first to claim ecology as a territory of ideas, as agents for design and creativity in the 1990s. He writes, "The processes of which ecology and creativity speak are fundamental to the work of landscape architecture. Whether biological or imaginative, evolutionary or metaphorical, such processes are active, dynamic, and complex, each tending toward the increased differentiation, freedom, and richness of a diversely interacting whole." Felix Guattari, writing in 1988 in 3 Ecologies, argues that ecology is as much bound up in issues of social and economic power, demographies, political struggles, and engagement as it is operating in relationship to environmental forces. Rainer Banham talks of a combination of what he calls geography, climate, economics, demography, mechanics, and culture, made evident only via movement on the city's characteristic roads and freeways, that constitutes what he calls the 4 organizational ecologies for metropolitan Los Angeles. And Kazis Farnalis refers to the networked ecologies of Los Angeles as, quote, "a series of codependent systems of environmental mitigation, land use organization, communication, and service delivery." Now, all of this points to the idea of ecology as a design project, as a project of the imagination. Christopher Haidt's contribution reinforces this idea. He claims ecology is one of the most important epistemological frameworks of our age. He writes, "Rather than understand ecology as a dominant and authoritative imposition that threatens the traditions of the design disciplines, a view taken on by a number of my architectural colleagues at the GSD, here design becomes the nexus of mediation between the social, the subjective, and the ontological. Design becomes perhaps the central practice and way of thinking about our ecological condition and of intervening within it. Instead of adopting nature as a model, we need to urbanize ecology." Now, all this leads to 2 important ideas bound up in the book and its title. First, projective. The projective recognizes the constructed nature of ecologist models for the physical and dynamic aspects of the natural world. Stuart Pickett, in the opening conference, which precipitated this book, he is an ecologist. He noted that all ecologists have to work with are their conceptual models of ecosystems, as only rarely can they test ideas on and in the ecosystem itself. And he notes that this is common practice with designers who draw and model, thereby fully embracing the creative and speculative ambitions of what we all do. Now, the second piece, ecologies. Here there's a recognition of a plurality of ecological theories and applied research in the natural sciences, as well as its broader social and cultural interpretations. Interestingly, this plural perspective has come full circle. Ernst Haeckel's first use of the term ecology in 1866 was rooted in the relational context between plants, animals, and their geophysical environment. It was in this context that he provided the first visual guide to ecology with a phylogenetic chart of the evolution of life. Now, of course, you have landscape ecology, human ecology, urban ecology, ecosystem ecology, evolutionary ecology, restoration ecology, deep ecology, etc., etc. These are but a few of the specialized areas of ecologically oriented research that have emerged over the past next decades. In this regard, then, the collective body of work is a recognition of a growing alignment between these ideas and contemporary theories about the complex, unpredictable, and emergent nature of the world which is increasingly recognized as a hybrid of culture and nature. Now, in the first chapter of the book, we identify 3 parallel genealogies in the natural sciences, in the humanities, and in design that inform our thinking and our work today. And I want to just briefly take you through those genealogies, starting with the natural sciences. The origins of ecosystem ecology can be traced to the brothers Eugene Odum and Howard T. Odum. In 1953, they published the first English language textbook in ecology, The Fundamentals of Ecology, in which they explored the various interrelationships between plant and animal species, the geophysical environment, and the energy and matter within ecosystems, as well as their inputs from and outputs to their wider environments. Seems like there's a commotion.
There's a football game outside. Sorry, I can't remember anything about that.
Excellent. All right. Well, I'll speed up and we can go.
Sorry.
That's okay. That's fine. It really took until the 1960s, though, for ecology to be considered a valid science. It is, after all, the interdisciplinary science of relationships by definition. And in this regard, ecology's acceptance was in no small measure tied to a rise in modern environmentalism, in part fueled by Rachel Carson in 1962 in her iconic work, Silent Spring. Now, others like C.S. Halling pioneered the notion of resilience and its implications for adaptive management practices. In his 1970 essay on the new ecology and large-scale resource management, he seeded new interest in the dynamism of the natural environment among non-scientific audiences and suggested new ways of working therein. Again, I want to note, this is a 1970 article where it's talking about the new ecology and its implications on the planning practices. Richard Foreman's research in the 1970s and 1980s is a key example of a new direction in applied ecology, including in urbanizing landscapes. Working at the GSD at Harvard, Foreman drew from ecosystem ecology and the concomitant development of long-term ecological research programs across the northeastern United States, developing new understandings of and new terminologies for ecological systems, matrices, webs, and networks, adjacencies, overlaps, and juxtapositions. His notational drawings of movements, of interrelations, of operations, married an assessment of the physical landscape with its performance through time, thereby breaking down traditional conceptions of a static landscape. Robert E. Cook's essay, Do Landscapes Learn from the 1990s, drills deeper into the emerging new paradigm and cites studies that demonstrate how disturbance and change were inherent to living systems. Cook speaks directly to designers. He outlines the possibilities of using the new model of ecology as both mechanism and metaphor for design practices in landscape architecture. Today's contemporary work by Earl Ellis, among others, builds on these foundations to develop new anthropogenic taxonomies for global bioregions. And by my colleague Peter Del Tredici on valuing the emergent and adaptive flora of cities. This continues to press the ways in which we understand humans as caught up in and inextricably part of ecosystems in action. Such work and thinking is taken up by young designers like David Fletcher, who writes about the emergent and accidental freakologies, as he calls them, that have arisen from the concentration of urban infrastructures along the Los Angeles River. Now, shifting to the humanities, while scientists were making their work known through scientific journals, a number of researchers in the humanities began exploring the social and cultural implications of this emerging research. And in doing so, they engaged wider audiences. Daniel Botkin was one of the first science writers to establish a bridge between the natural sciences and the humanities. His 1990 work, Discordant Harmonies, told engaging stories about moose on an island in the Great Lakes, or elephants in Kenya's vast landscape. Stories that helped to overturn models of ecological stability based on evidence he was finding on the ground. He also traced a succession of concepts about ecology and environment via the metaphors of divine order, organic comrade, and the great machine, concepts that illustrate these ideas' cultural roots. Botkin posited a new, all-embracing yet situational model of the dynamic biosphere, humans fully enmeshed in the forces and dynamics that influence climate and life on the planet. Yet the conditions that we may encounter on the ground are fleeting and momentary, caught up in cycles and dynamics which are ever-changing and somewhat just out of reach. Like Holling, Botkin argues that our management practices must adapt themselves to these new ideas. Now, Botkin had a rich set of compatriots at the time. Robert Pogue Harrison, writing from the perspective of literature and arts history, in his 1993 work, Forests, documents many civilizations' attempts to conceptualize their interrelationship with the natural world. And he noted that we can really only talk about the natural world or ecology via a set of models that are intrinsically human, establishing this idea of a relationship or interrelationship. You know, Everton in 1992, arguing from the perspective of social history and philosophy, argues for qualities as opposed to nameable things that might describe that which exists beyond human control. Wildness, he writes, is not ours. It is self-willed, independent, and indifferent to our dictates and judgments. An entity with the quality of wildness is its own and no others. So at the same time that these folks were trying to understand our presence within the organic biosphere, Everton is still looking for that bit of wild nature that is absolutely beyond our reach, slightly beyond the control of humans. Sanford Quinter, writing from the perspective of art and cultural theory, in his 2008 essay, Wildness, Prolegomena to a New Urbanism, links the wild to society and design culture. The wild, he writes, is the logic of animal societies, packs, flocks, and swarms, of the immixings and inadvertencies of the natural world, storms, quakes, abundance, extinction, and of complex adaptive systems in general, even those of an entirely artificial kind. Quinter here calls for a redefinition of the design project and the broader project of urbanism in ways that exhibit or sustain essential characteristics of messiness, of indirectness, of openness, and indeterminacy. Again, he writes, to approximate these ecological forces and structures, to tap, approximate, borrow, and transform morphogenetic processes from all aspects of wild nature, to invent artificial means of creating living artificial environments. All this, of course, had direct and indirect impact on design thinking and practices. In many ways, contemporary ideas of ecology and planning can be traced to the work of Ian McHarg in the late 1960s and early 1970s, in which his analysis and assessment of natural resources, geology, soil, water, habitat, etc., could inform the best places and ways to develop land for social occupation. McHarg's overlay method, itself the root of modern GIS, opened up planning thought to the idea of interconnectedness between cities and suburbs on the one hand and the natural world on the other, hence the title of his book, Design with Nature. And McHarg wasn't the only one. Richard Foreman's work, cited earlier, importantly recognized the dynamic living nature of ecological systems, not just the physical stuff that McHarg was mapping, but how the material of the physical world supports the movement and exchange of ecological matter. Still others in the design disciplines pushed these ideas further. Rich Haig at the Bloedel Reserve in Washington State both hyper-amplified woodland decay and decomposition in the moss garden and framed out groundwater fluctuation, a phenomenon that extended far beyond the garden or the reserve in the beautifully simple and abstract hedge garden. Both of these gardens were firmly rooted in landscape traditions, but gave new presence to those forces and dynamics that are beyond the control of the designer, and whose informants and implications reach to scales of influence much larger than the scale of that particular project. The early work of George Hargreaves and Hargreaves Associates and the work of the so-called earth artists, who greatly informed that work, extended this trajectory of design research. Candlestick Point Park on San Francisco Bay was among the early works of the firm that deliberately engaged open-ended environmental processes, and it did so more explicitly than Haig's work. Here, a taut plane of lawn gave way along its edges to an extension of the rocky intertidal zone of the bay, physically and spatially bringing the waters of the bay and its various offerings of floating logs and condoms and animal skeletons and plastic bottles and waste into the space of the park. While Haig's hedge garden was an inward-focused, carefully framed space with a simple plane of water that would register environmental cycles, Hargreaves' Candlestick project radically inverted this relationship, throwing open the space of the public park and subjecting it to the larger forces of the bay. Now, these experiments and speculations were not isolated. Michael van Valkenburg's 1988 ice walls at Radcliffe College examined the freezing, thawing, and visual temporal effects of water in its multiple states over time. Rem Koolhaas and OMA had a proposal for the Parc de la Villette that included a forest conceived as a temporal garden that allowed the growth tendencies of two contrasting tree species to play off one another and create ever-changing vegetal and spatial effects. A garden that was legitimate no matter what point in time you encountered it, not something that was waiting for full growth and an ideal condition. There were many more, of course, too. Now, the shift in ecological thinking and research and its counterparts in process-oriented design experiments opened new worlds for critical discourse in design and urbanism. Stan Allen, the architect, identified the new ecology along with engineering systems as important examples of what he called material practices, which focused not so much on what things look like, as he wrote, but more so on what they can do. This was a significant moment. Allen's explicit reference to the work of landscape ecologist Foreman, marrying the operative and performative aspects of dynamic ecologies with emerging design theory, moved the discussion of complex adaptive systems out of the domain of environmentalism and landscape alone and into the center of design discourse and theory. Allen's continuing work in collaboration with James Corner and with Nina Marie Lister in Toronto's Downsview Park competition imagined the setting up of physical scaffolds that would sponsor the propagation of emergent ecologies, natural systems that would be seeded initially and would evolve with an increasing level of complexity and adaptability over time. Now, even the Downsview competition brief was in itself significant in that it required entries to account for long-term timeframes and to make explicit some comfort with irreducible uncertainty in terms of project evolution. Now, since this time, a number of design practices have taken up these ideas, while others have adopted analogs of responsive systems to inform design thinking. Here you can think of any number of adaptive building systems and materials that have emerged over the last 15 years or so. You can also begin to think of large-scale ecological cyborgs, which hybridize infrastructural function and ecological responsiveness at the scale of the city. This being one proposal out of my office for some work in Dallas that I'll tell you about in a few minutes. Two, landscape designers like Jane Wolfe have been exploring the future implications of human and cultural settlements in rich dynamic environments with her work on the Sacramento Delta and on New Orleans and the Mississippi Delta. Now, in this vein, I want to return to the idea of the projective. Part of the project, of course, was to collect and curate these archival, prototypical, and contemporary images and drawings that explore the implications of emerging ecological models for design. Here we've arranged the drawings in broad categories derived from definitions of specific ecological characteristics that both reflect and reinterpret central ideas within complex adaptive systems theory. I'll take you through these. We've set these up as a sort of she said, he said, she being the ecologist, Nina Marie, providing us with a natural science definition of a particular term that we've isolated, and then he, me, beginning to talk about that idea's implication for design thinking and design practices. So there are 5 of these, starting with dynamics. From the natural sciences standpoint, the normal pattern of observed changes to prevailing ecosystem conditions, functions, and their related ecological structures. But operational dynamics and choreographies also extend to design landscapes in entire cities, and they hint at the blurring, the overlap, and interdependence, or full hybridization of environmental and urban systems. Here we think about the scoring of pedestrian and human movements, this Larry Halperin, as influenced by his wife, a dance choreographer, as well as the productive alignment of bird and bee behaviors with buildings and infrastructures. The movements of wastes and resources, pollution and water across large urban territories, as well as inventive ways to record and project the movement of individual agents across real and fictional territories. 2, succession, the process by which one ecosystem community is gradually replaced by another, which usually leads to communities more diverse in their structures and functions. Now, early successional models implied a continuous development of ecological structures to a single paramount and inevitably balanced and stable climax state, thereby perpetuating the myth of the fragile balance of nature. But more recently, with influence from ecosystem ecology and complex systems theories, contemporary models of succession emphasize polyclimax states that are themselves dynamic, shifting through time and over multiple spatial scales linked to disturbance regimes that are arguably native to every ecosystem on Earth. From a design perspective, increasing complexity often brings along with it decreasing levels of control and varying degrees of possibility. Here we think about activated plant seeding, growth, and seasonal cycles. Habitat, cultivation, and diversification as the engine for project evolution and phasing, linear trajectories of time and process and history, and ecological infrastructural productive sequences that open up projects to the forces around them. Third, emergence, a phenomenon characteristic of patterns that arise through the collective actions of many individual entities and the multiplicity of their interactions. Here, collectivity and multiplicity predominate, whereby multiple internal protocols and external inputs interact and inform the reconceptualization of landscapes and infrastructures at a range of scales. Here you have individual agents that play ongoing roles in existing and proposed landscapes and cities, hydrologic, ecological, and jurisdictional mechanisms that intersect and play off one another. The seasonality of protective metropolitan infrastructures, and the crafting of humid and thermal atmospheres, all part of an understanding of the world in an eternal state of becoming. Fourth, resilience. And this is one that really gets me Marie's goat, the way that resilience is being appropriated these days, particularly in the context of some of the work around Superstorm Sandy and protecting New York, where resilience has been translated to mean resistance. From an ecological perspective, though, resilience is the ability of an ecosystem to withstand and absorb the effects of sometimes unpredictable and sudden changes to prevailing environmental conditions while still maintaining the majority of its structures and functions. However, resilience also implies that changes may result in a reorganization of the system's structures and functions into a new or alternate steady state. In short, a new state of normal may emerge for any given system. Here then, creative instabilities are invoked and multiple states of being are possible even within the same space or territory. Thinking about Piscean occupation of dissimilar ecological space, horticultural occupations of varying geologic and hydrologic territories, the mapping and fluctuation of urban and hydrologic choreographies, and the appropriation of four-dimensional modeling techniques that simulate and project reciprocal growth and flow strategies. And finally, adaptability, the capacity to adapt, that is, to learn from and transform based on ecosystem dynamics, and the resulting changes that normally occur in any living system. Here, an ongoing set of prompts, interventions, and triggers renew or redirect processes in action. Design here has agency and intention in the act of redirecting, but in no way is it fully controllable. The mechanics at work are autonomous, independent, and multivariate. The designer here becomes more of a producer or a curator of effects. Here we think of bee behavior in response to changes in ambient temperature. The interactive staging and of construction processes and growth mechanisms. The training and management practices that spur new independent ecologies. The collusion of hydrologic and social agendas, lifespan and project renewal processes, and coordinated maintenance operations and administrative regimens that respond, learn, and change over time. But what now? The Projective Ecologies project importantly points forward, offering departure points as the project of complex adaptive systems and design is updated, reformulated, and superseded. Now, on the one hand, Nina Marie reminds us that more large-scale testing of successional ecologies in situ is needed. Few extended demonstrations exist, especially in urban settings. These would be important, providing us feedback and new information as we begin to think forward. But also there are extensions of this thinking into practice that offer new tactics for how we work. First, collaboration and messiness. Frances Wesley and Catherine McGowan provide insights from the social scientists on the ways in which messiness, that is, non-linear, experimental, and sometimes chaotic processes of iteration, discovery, and feedback can advance problem-solving and collaborative initiatives in multiple realms, including governance, business, and design. There are also new ideas for how we might speculate and project, particularly with visualization. Recently, new modeling programs and visualization techniques offer a path forward for exploration and experimentation. Flow modeling, scripting, and processing software in particular offer time-based platforms for representing and programming change and evolution. You saw earlier examples of this from Brad Cantrell, shown here some of my work with students at the GSD, using Aquaveo, a platform that's typically used by hydrologic engineers, in this case to explore the agency of water flow, relative to an underwater garden of oysters and seaweed. In a sense, we've co-opted the software in order to use it as a projective as well as analytical device. There are also examples of studio-based work from the GSD. No. I'm okay. We're back. Studio-based work that explores the projective potentials of four-dimensional modeling techniques that emphasize flow and process, time and change. This is work by Taeyong Park and Haimen Choi about the microprocesses of water in the Los Angeles River. They were interested in this idea of creating a place for the study of turbulence. This is not a romantic or restorative approach to water in the LA River, but one that's more fine-tuned to the metabolics of effluent, runoff, transportation networks, concrete channels, and soft bottoms that characterize the river today. It's a nimble strategy for dynamic hydrologic gardens that serve no direct function other than experimentation with and experience of water processes and phenomena. Second project by Alice Chai, a projective landscape strategy for continually remaking the dried out Owens Valley. Here, Alice was interested in a set of proposed interventions that would transform the dust storm into a performative and consumable event, and activate Owens Lake into a kinetic and responsive field of dust control and dust-inducing measures that could respond to different user groups, to seasonal changes, and to wind patterns. Here she introduced a set of moving redistribution creatures and interactive fields that could continually recalibrate the ecological and experiential futures of this place. Again, not in the interest of restoring a past ecology, but in the interest of continually creating an unfolding set of ecologies into the future. Sean Lally's essay on energy identifies a new territory for exploration in which the performative aspects of design are pushed to modulate microclimates and energy flows, and thereby create new logics for design, as well as new vocabularies about atmospheres, gradients, intensities, and washes that can supplant ecologically derived categories of thinking. Sanford Quinter speculates further, broadening the context for our expanded understandings of ecology to plumb the anthropologic realms, and in particular, the deep human relationship to our physical environment, with reference to theories developed by Jakob von Utzkow and Richard Wrangham. Quinter opens up new worlds for discovery and speculation, perhaps eventual testing, that include human physiology, human and animal ethology, and social environmental relations. Now, outside the book, where and how do these ideas reverberate? I've shown you a couple examples from studio. Lately, over the last 6 years, in the context of course studios for landscape architects, we've been exploring these ideas in the context of city-making projects in and around New York City, with the explicit agenda of starting with ecological dynamics and environmental flux, often looking at issues of water and sediment flows, fluctuation, inundation, et cetera, played out at multiple scales and in relationship to the formative physical world that might give rise to those processes. Here we're looking at issues of landform and landscape. On the one hand, on formative urban infrastructures and on their implications for the entire urban district. Now, some of these projects, like this one, directly engage ecological and hydrologic flux. This one really looking at sediment and water flows, deposition, erosion, and its sort of analog and implication for an urban fabric always in a state of change, responding to those environmental conditions over time. Other of these projects apply analogous approaches to open-ended real estate strategies that allow for both urban density and environmental intensity in dynamic relationship to one another. In practice, these ideas play themselves out, again, at a range of scales, and I'll show you two. Flexibility and adaptability allow for public spaces, for instance, to accommodate different events and activities, and even adapt themselves to new circumstances, physical, hydrologic, programmatic, and political, over the long term. The plaza at Harvard University initiates what I want to call a new set of social ecologies that unfold through the daily and annual life of the space. The project plays on people's inexhaustible craving for discovery, for physical and sensorial experience, for social interaction of many sorts. It's flexible and is set up, equipped to be programmed and reprogrammed over time. It encourages appropriation of many flavors for activities that might be planned and others that might be spontaneous or unforeseen. In the language of complex adaptive systems ecology, it is dynamic, open-ended, and adaptable. These same principles of diversity, flexibility, and adaptability are also addressed at the scale of the human body in dual seating elements. Here, custom-designed wood benches are shaped to accommodate different bodies in different ways, allowing people options for how they choose to sit, cross-legged, upright, slouchy, or lounging, alone or in groups, on laps, cuddling, or outright lying down and scratching your belly, like this guy. Digital design and fabrication tools allow for simple transitions between specific measured bench profiles, producing a wide variety of sitting options to appeal to people's moods or to their physical needs and desires. The fixed benches are complemented by movable tables and chairs, which allow for endless rearrangement on any given day. Here, the plaza's embedded flexibility and diversity, in a sense, sets it up for a constantly evolving life, equally compelling when throbbing with activity or when small groups are quietly studying or moving through. It is a simple platform for the playing out of social dynamics, evolving ecologies of public space. Now, in Dallas, at the scale of the city, we were interested in creating a metabolic urbanism that turns the wastes of the city into thriving ecological and social districts, thus enhancing the health of the city and the environment at large. Now, much of this project is built off a retuned stormwater system based on the old alignment of the river that is designed to breed new forms of ecological and urban life at the center of 3 intensely developed new neighborhoods. One of which is centered on a new aviary and music garden, here. One centered on a new urban beach, and one centered on a celebratory new water amphitheater. Now, this project also has to do with a nimble, flexible, and responsive implementation strategy that can adapt itself to prompts and to changing social, environmental, political conditions over time. It's an opportunistic strategy, and it can deal in real time to political changes, financial and economic changes, changes and shifts in priority. But the idea here is to inaugurate a set of tactics, to identify a set of catalyst projects, and then allow the dynamics that ensue to begin to build and become more and more complex over time. Now, all of this, admittedly, is just the beginning. The bigger project initiated by the book is to better and more critically understand both the context for and implications of the various relationships that have developed between ecological and design thinking, to develop new frameworks for thinking, new synergies and cross-fertilizations among disciplines, and new ways of designing within a dynamic living world. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. That was pretty amazing.
Thanks. Are you full?
I'm full. My brain is full. I thank Chris very much for the lecture and the book. Timely, as he has said. We have some time for questions before we wrap up the evening. Kate,
I have a yell. I don't need a microphone.
oh, okay. Go ahead.
It's great to have that slide there because my question really relates to how a project of that scale that requires such a long time frame, so the staged implementation of it, what kind of governance structure the project has? Is it the kind of project that's managed by a city's local government structure, or is it a state? How do you get something that might take 20 years to implement carried out?
So this one's quite unique because it's Dallas, Texas, where they don't have big government and they've got a lot of cowboys. So you don't have the strong mayor system that East or West Coast American cities have. You don't have strong planning departments. Dallas is interesting because they figured out a very special coalition between a little bit of central government and philanthropy and private developers. In fact, there's an urban design studio in City Hall that's funded through philanthropy and becomes their urban design arm for doing good work. They work very carefully with a coalition of active developers and with some of the other sort of regulatory city agencies in order together to move work forward. So this project, underlying this project, are a number of strategies that say, okay, well, not only have we put landscape systems where it would be very difficult to develop, for instance, but we've also put new urban neighborhoods where we know single landowners own very large pieces of contiguous land. Combine that with an initiative to draw in the philanthropic community, sometimes through art installations, other times through direct sponsorship or donation of some of the landscape projects. Also the idea that we're tapping into other groups that are on the ground doing urban nurseries through funding that's all their own that they get from other sources. What we've done is developed a strategy that can tap into each of those different clients, if you will, and kind of use that sort of amorphous mass of sort of uncertainty as a way forward. So we're not asking them to change the way they do business or structure government. We are asking that that coalition then comes together in a way that begins to sponsor these individual projects. So within this context, we can identify, okay, this particular developer, that particular set of potential donors to a project can help something move forward. So it's a little squishy, But in this case, the strategy is absolutely tuned to that project. In other cases, we simply work with a strong mayor and a planning authority to figure out, well, what are the development tools for a project like this that could be implemented so that we're bringing new resources to the project that simply go beyond the scope of the landscape, if you will, in order to greatly enrich what we might be able to do in a particular place. But it's very finely tuned to each individual place and client instead of constituencies.
So have they started with any projects developed?
Yeah, so in fact, with this one, we've been hired by the developer who owns a very large tract of land in the southern part of the site. Now, he's paying for it, but actually we're studying half of the entire water system in concert with that. While we're down there, we're also talking to the Dallas Museum of Arts as a way to get them to begin to think about how to sponsor art and cultural installations on the riverfront. They're a public museum, so we want to partner with them. We've had discussions with a number of organizations and the city and TxDOT, the Department of Transportation, that are now installing some of the tree nurseries that will supply not only trees for the bigger forest areas, but for some of the street trees throughout the city. And then there's another developer up on the north end that's starting to formulate his plans in conjunction with the general plans that have been developed here. In the meantime, the Urban Design Studio at the city are developing more detailed urban framework, guidelines, policies to sort of go along with this. So our goal is to get some kind of project going to show success, even with the water gardens here. I mean, that's 8 acres and easy $25 million within the context of philanthropy down there. It's nothing. Show a little development. The trick there is working with all the authorities having authority over the water system, which is the big stormwater system for the city, and that stormwater will be cleaned before it's then pumped into the bigger river system. So there's a lot of interagency coordination to go along there, but that's where my friendly hydrologic engineer comes in handy. He can talk the talk that the engineers need to hear.
Reese.
Yeah, hi, thanks for your talk, Chris. I had kind of picking up where your presentation was finished. I'm interested in the distinctions between design intentions and expectations and the actuality of a realised project.
Yep.
And I'm just wondering what's the role going forward of built work as empirical cases
Yep.
in kind of furthering the body of work you've got here, and I suppose specifically in relation to your practice, what mechanisms are in place or do you see being put in place to learn specifically from those empirical?
Yeah. We love the idea of a design experiment that can get built. And we've had a number of them. One of them involved rubber, boarding place rubber, typically used in playground environments. We had a public playground project, and at that point, particularly in America, a lot of surfaces were being poured horizontally. We showed something that had topography in it. The client freaked out. They said, how do you do this? We've never seen it. It's going to, explode or something. And at the same time, we were commissioned at the International Garden Festival in Granity, Quebec, to do a little garden. So we took this material, created an undulating topography, poured the material over it, and used 3 summers worth of visitors and photographs of their visitors, and frankly the fact that the garden survived in a very, very harsh winter climate for a number of years. First, to prove to a public client that actually it is viable to do that, but second, to use it to inform the ways in which we think about people's behavior. The fact that you don't have to have a landscape that tells people, well, here you sit, here you do this. that you can create something that's quite abstract, and people being curious will start to engage it. Kids are really quite good at this. They'll just sort of, enter a garden like that and start to create games and run all over it. Adults too, when nudged, will kind of do that. Fortunately, at the garden festival, there was a little bar set up next to it so people could have a cocktail, and then it was easier to nudge them into the garden to start to play. But we used those. We had a great construction manager too, who kept photographing everybody who entered and what they were doing for us. So we have this great visual evidence for that. At Harvard, we have the same thing. We actually have a webcam where whenever we want, we can pull up the webcam and see what's happening. I use it particularly to see what food trucks are there on any particular day that I'm hungry.
In the context of the Harvard example, is that project drawing in attention from people in the natural sciences to be studied as a distinct case, or?
Not so much yet. We've started this conversation though with ecologists, because ecologists, natural scientists always think that their work is foundational to the work that we do. And I think I've had success, and frankly having you agree helps, but we've had some success engaging a number of natural scientists on the idea that, well, wait a minute, the ways that we are starting to think about the implications of their work might now reverberate back on the ways in which that they do research and experimentation. So I think there's a world to be opened up there and a set of conversations to really be engaged. What else? Yeah.
I have a question coming from a different angle. Actually, this is distinction between ecology and nature. I appreciate that you mentioned the discussion of the wild, especially coming from Quinter's point of view. Now, of course, Quinter, his earlier research is pretty much predicated from Nietzsche's point of view. So there's this kind of human will triumph everything. That's coming back to Quinter. But back to this distinction between ecology and nature, I mean, in your presentation, it struck me as something that, as if ecology can actually write off time. And when I say time, it's the traumatic time. Because in nature, bad things does happen. So when that happens, there's the before and after. So the after is always the attempt to cope. So some would say that this whole effort to cope hence opens up the possibility for the advent for civilization. But in your talk, I noticed that it's very interesting that this whole projective ecology actually is trying to say that nature is always already cultural. It's been culturalized, right? Because it's projective ecology. So it's not only ecology, it's projective. So there's always a cultural intention embedded in this ecological landscape already. Hence, Dallas makes sense. Because Dallas is a town built by oil and cotton. So from the beginning, the town is built by a handful of people. So based on that, of course, a kind of projective ecology would work. So, but this is a kind of general reaction to your talk. But coming down to that question, how do you differentiate hence nature and ecology now? Is there a distinction? Or actually, we are pretty much shielded within a condition that there's only ecology.
Yeah, I haven't talked about nature much. I mean, I think nature is a characterization of the world out there. I think it's okay to say environment when you're referring to something that is maybe initiated from a non-human perspective. I mean, I guess I very much see us as part of the dynamic, fully enmeshed in those dynamics, having influence more and more these days over what those dynamics are, what the climate and environmental conditions are. But I also acknowledge that there are certain forces that are you know, beyond our direct control. And so there's this tension. That's to me what's rich about it, is we can set up these systems, but we have to set up these systems in a way that account for some of the things we know, but also acknowledge that there are other dynamics in play in a way that we cannot fully control these things. What that allows for it allows for other things to happen in ways that can fully enrich the project, but it also allows those environments, I think, to adapt themselves to other conditions over time. It's interesting that you said early on that sometimes nature does bad things. That's a very human perspective, right? I mean, nature's just doing its thing. It doesn't care about us, right? It's just doing it. And sometimes floods happen, but that's not necessarily bad for the environment. It's a way to kind of enrich and continue the dynamics and life in that particular place. I think the question for us is, how do we stop thinking about what are the bad implications of some of the things that the environment might be doing, and how is it that we can design our cities to play along with some of those forces and dynamics over time. I think typically when we get into trouble from one of these events, it's because we've set up cities and systems that try to resist or control those natural forces rather than working with them.
So how do you differentiate Dallas from New Orleans, the two cities? I mean, following your argument.
They're both constructed systems. They're both subject to a whole set of kind of hydrologic and ecological forces that extend far beyond the scale and capacity of each of those cities. Again, New Orleans has good jazz, you know, better food. I mean, there are many ways you can begin to think about that, but for us, the question is, how do you take on each of those cities on their own terms, not to try to idealize them, not to try to recreate an idea of some nature version of the environment that existed before, but how do you take all of what's in play on its own terms and in some way turn those cities, those projects inside out, that open themselves up maybe to a new set of hybrid environmental, cultural dynamics that might begin to evolve over time. I think that's a very deep, long conversation we could have over some very good food.
I'm just curious.
Good question. So perhaps a lighter question. Linda.
I have a relatively easy one. Naomi Klein's book, This Changes Everything, she talks about the fact that resilience isn't enough, and that we've really got to start thinking about regenerative ecologies and regenerative ways of designing and building. And I'm just wondering if in your 5 words, is that part of the projective aspect of this, in terms of, you know, how these places actually start in themselves transforming and generating?
Yeah, and I don't know the book, but just based on what you've said, I think, too, she's picking up on this misreading of what the term resilience means. Resilience really means the ability to adapt and be regenerative, right? To create something new, using some of the same structures and DNA that's already embedded into the system. How is it that you allow for sometimes significant transformation of what that place might be about? And you think about, you know, Lower Manhattan, it's hard to imagine skyscrapers picking themselves up and sort of moving around and all that. Fair enough, but I also don't want to mistake Big's plan for a sort of socially active version of a dike for anything else but a dike. It's there to resist, not to be resilient, not to be regenerative in that way. I think projects like Dallas, 20th century city is actually, for me, a really great testing ground for these ideas because there's space, they're horizontal, there are moments of intensity and density among them, but there's room to maneuver. And I think in so many ways, New York, Boston, San Francisco, densities like that, London, Sydney, may actually be not the best places to really experiment with some of these, but it's more the Phoenixes, the Houstons, the Dallases, the sprawled cities, where we have a little bit more maneuvering space, a little bit more space to see how these things might play themselves out on the ground and actually start to reconfigure or regenerate what's in place.
And just given, say, the Dallas example, how will you measure the success of a project over time, given you're talking about a dynamic process, and ultimately the outcome might be entirely different to what the framework you put in place, and so that it might be a failure, but it just is different. How are you measuring that success? or failure?
Well, in a sense, I mean, there are a set of underlying ideas or principles behind the work. What you're seeing is one iteration of that. Necessarily, clients get very nervous when you say, well, it could be this or this or this or this or this, and they want to know which one they're buying. So we show them one, but oftentimes with these projects, we will be explicit about what those critical principles are, and then how you judge it based on performance over time, not necessarily on the formal or sometimes even sculptural relationships that are formed. I mean, some of the work I did prior to starting my own practice and really getting into teaching, a lot of that work was very composed and sculptural. And the question always came, well, okay, we have a new donor, they want to do something, we have a new condition. And all of a sudden there was a crisis, like, oh my God, how do you insert something new into this precisely calibrated sculptural ensemble? So for me, coming out of that, I get a very good sense of the extent to which form matters in terms of creating our experience, the way form matters in terms of how it allows water to be collected or infiltrated, et cetera, et cetera. But for me, the form is there to support the performance that's important over time. So we can develop a set of formal tactics, if you will, for a project and say, well, it's this set of combinations of these kinds of elements or these kinds of moves. In a sense, it doesn't matter which of those play themselves out. They all have that kind of structural DNA and the integrity of the framework, the principle behind it. Whereas the final form, who knows ultimately what version of that thing you're going to get. So it's really based on that set of ideas that we're able to think about it and evaluate.
Any other questions? Wow, okay, well, terrific. That was a great set of questions, actually. We got a series of mini lectures in response. So once again, please join me in thanking Chris for making the effort to get here, putting together this book, which I think you, by now, you all have just earned a semester's worth of credit if you pass the test that I'm going to send you tomorrow on the lecture. But this book is really, I think, a very impressive effort to consolidate and reflect on the understandings of ecology, the work that's been conducted in parallel, and to help us think about and understand how we might embrace ecology as we move forward as designers of the built environment. I appreciate that we have some architects in the room, so it's been terrific to have you here. And Chris, thank you for a very well-structured structured and articulate presentation. It was, a few of us in the room have had the privilege of listening to 2 lectures by Chris in 2 days and 2 very different takes. But I'm just so thankful for your work. I mean, as you said, it's timely. It's really timely for us to just pause for a moment and think about what landscape architecture is, what it's been doing, and where it needs to go, and really investigating ecology for its potential. So, thank you, and special thanks from the faculty. I don't want to embarrass you,
That's heavy.
and you know, running
I know
around.
there's a weight limit to it.
I know, we'd be more than happy to ship that to you, I promise. I know, I'm well aware that there's a weight limit. I go to the States to shop, so and to carry your technology
Ah,
with
wonderful.
you at a little
Ah,
University of
beautiful.
New South Wales. So
Great.
we do hope that you'll come back sometime. And I think this is the beginning of a conversation, a really terrific conversation. So
I
thanks
hope so.
again.
Thank you.
And thank you all for coming.
Thank you.